He was despised and rejected by men. Isaiah 53. He was bruised for our iniquities. Iniquities. Lawlessness. Not following his instructions. Not continuing in his word. That's why we were bruised. And he was bruised for our iniquities. Because we rejected, because we despised him. The sinfulness of sin is incredible. What it does to a man or a woman, and yet we hear very little teaching on the sinfulness of sin, and that's why he came. That's the reason he came, is to deliver us from that. And the only reason that we would continue to be bruised is if we continued in false teaching, false doctrine. And we don't need to be that way. And over in Luke 4, we see a spot where they handed Yeshua the scroll, and he opened it up to Isaiah 61, and he said, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor." The good news to the poor, that their sins can be forgiven. And there is eternal life waiting on them. The sufferings of this life can't be compared. Can't be compared to what he's prepared for them, for the poor. The rich, yes, a rich man can make it. But how hard it is for a rich man to make it. Because he trusts in his riches for salvation. More than likely only in this life, but there are some that trust in their riches for later too. You can see examples of that out there. Everybody knows about the pharaohs. They would bury their gold with them. And there are people that are around today that the only thing that they have, the only thing that they can hold on to show that they have any worth, is their riches. And Jesus showed up and preached the gospel to the poor. He said he has sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to preach deliverance to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, and to set at liberty them that are bruised. There that word is again. And over in John chapter 9, we can see an example of the recovery of sight to the blind. This is yet another demonstration of the divinity and deity of Jesus, that he is God. And yet they continued to reject him, the leaders, the religious leaders, the people that were teaching the people their false doctrine. And they kept rejecting him. And that's why he preached the gospel to the poor. But over there in Isaiah 42, we can see another prophetic utterance there from Isaiah. It's called the Song of the Servant by some, but I may butcher this, but he said something like, "My servant, behold, look at my servant, in whom I delight, my soul delights." He says he is his elect one. He says, I've put my spirit on him to open blind eyes. That's where I wanted to get to. He is there to open the blind eyes. And those who sit in darkness, he brought light. Miracles in the Old Testament were extremely rare. There were some, just a few though, just a few. But they were very, very rare. And then all of a sudden Jesus comes on the scene, and there's an explosion of miracles. John said over there in the back of his book, he said that if everything that Jesus did could be written down. The books in the world could not contain it. There were no blind eyes opened in the Old Testament. Zero. You can't find any. But then all of a sudden, he opens all these blind eyes. Boom, everywhere. And you know, this miracle alone should have elevated their view of Jesus and his divinity. And it should have caused them to leave their false teaching. But it didn't. As a matter of fact, the only thing it did was elevated their animosity and hatred for him. It just escalates. So what happens after that? You keep reading. You see that Jesus begins to abandon the religious leaders. I wonder if he'd do that today to the religious leaders of today. If they continue to teach their false doctrine, would he abandon them? I think he would. But then, you know, going back to John chapter 9, we can see some things. But you know, after he begins to abandon the false teachers, he begins to turn his attention towards the disciples and those willing to do his will, those who would listen to him and learn and stay. I mean, a recap of John chapter 8, we see Jesus, he was in the temple, he was in the treasury. He says, I am the light of the world. He that follows me shall not walk in darkness, but have the light of life. And then the Pharisees looked at him and said, well, you bear witness of yourself. And then he looks back at them and he says, my witness is true. He says, I'm going away and you're going to seek me, but you ain't going to find me. And then and then he says to him, he says, I speak what I hear the Father say, and I do what I see the Father do. And he goes on down, and finally he gets to a tipping point, where he looks at them, he says, you guys are sinners, and y'all going to stay in your sin, and you're going to die in your sin. And they said, we're Abraham's descendants. And he said, you know what? Before Abraham was, I am. And then they took up stones to stone him. That sent them over the edge, and he passed through their midst. Take everything I say with a grain of salt, and remember to give to the widows, the orphans, and the poor, please.